The new technical regulations in 2022 saw the biggest shakeup in the history of the sport, and with the ground floor effect being brought back, every team tried to design their own way to greatness. However, only one team was successful enough to do so, and the rest of the teams are going to ditch their designs and follow the RB19's successful floor for as much as it's possible. But nonetheless, every top F1 team's car, besides Aston Martin, has been lifted in the air in Monaco, and we've been able to witness how the floors actually make the biggest difference performance-wise. So what's the secret behind the Red Bull, Aston Martin, Ferrari and Mercedes floors? As you already know, around 80% of the aerodynamic performance of a ground effect F1 car is attributed to the floor, and this was something that was introduced back in the 80s, effectively being banned due to the porpoising and the instability of the cars. The F1 Challengers weren't as heavy as they are right now, so it meant that the ground floor effect had the impact to literally airborne the car, which is definitely not something you want to see in the sport. But in today's era, it seems like it's drawing the best out of the team's innovation spectre, and the effectiveness of the floor is undoubtedly the #1 factor from which the car generates downforce and therefore is more agile in the slow, medium and high-speed corners. Furthermore, it helps with the generation of downforce on the main straights, making the car more stable under braking and while accelerating, which are the top factors that a driver needs in order to put out solid lap times. However, even though the regulations are practically the same for everybody out there, all of the teams had a different approach to the floor design, and the simplicity of the Mercedes and Ferrari floors has caught the F1 fans by surprise. This was further enhanced once we were able to compare the floors of Ferrari, Mercedes and Red Bull in Monaco, as you need to keep in mind that the version of the W14's floor was the upgraded one, not the simple one that they used to run before this GP. So what makes the difference between all these floors? First, let's start with the latest, or more precisely, the one that got upgraded recently, and that's the W14's floor. Mercedes brought a brand new philosophy to their car, and while many are betting on the side pod design to bring all of the performance out of the car, it's the other way around. They're now much more competitive due to what they've been able to mount beneath the drivers. At first sight, we can immediately see how the lateral peripheral section, more precisely the side edge, tends to be fundamentally and progressively uniform, even though it includes elements that are visually different from each other in terms of slits and lower diverting profiles. If you were able to compare the W14's floor to any other out there, it would have the biggest similarities to the SF23 and not to the RB19. And the major reason for that is because the narrow chassis of Mercedes doesn't allow them to entirely copy RB19's design and implement it on their own car, even though the side pod design was something that they could have mounted on the current form of the W14. One of the biggest differences, if you were to compare the floors of Mercedes and Red Bull, would be in the profile of the front air conveyors, which have a decidedly arched profile compared to the Austrian team's squad. The latest evolution of the Mercedes floor in terms of the Venturi channels has seen an increase in complexity and the central section, and now they're even split into a central and external portion, which only helps in generating downforce even more. This is something that Mercedes has been struggling with a lot with their latest version of the car, the increased drag and the lack of rear downforce. So thanks to the newest design of their floor, Mercedes is now seeking its spot next to Red Bull, something that Wolff and Allison are very adamant will happen very early this year. Maybe as early as in Silverstone, when the Silver Arrows are bringing yet another upgrade to the floor of their car. Compared to them, the SF23 profile of the channels remained single and decidedly more continuous, without any interruptions, up to the level of the throat of the diffuser. Ferrari were one of the teams that received massive backlash, mostly because they had one of the simplest floors out there. But considering that they had one of the best aerodynamic cars in 2022, the design of the floor was definitely something they needed to change in order to catch up, not only to the Austrian team, but to Aston Martin and Mercedes as well. The two floors on the SF23's floor in the central section still remain similar in terms of concept in relation to the constant depth of the channels. What I mean by this is that on both floors, there are no sudden changes that suddenly increase the depth of the channels, which therefore helps with maintaining their linear variation according to the main profile of the channel. Although the cross-sections of the channels are two different worlds, if you were to compare the floors of Mercedes and Ferrari, their vertical development is very consistent with a single wing profile without any interruptions. This is very important because it's practically the major difference that these two challengers have compared to the greatest of them all, RB19's floor. The bottom of the Red Bull's car not only has variations in the cross-section of the channels with narrowings that go on to create grooves and expansion sections, but it also contains evident interruptions in the longitudinal profile of the canals. Furthermore, it's worth mentioning that the grooves and the expansion section help determine predictable variations and speeds of the underlying flow as a desired consequence, which can only help in building a more predictable version of the car. If you were to understand one thing from the Red Bull's floor, it's that it has a lot of interruptions, and in practice, we could define them as almost dips in which the flow tends to detach itself for a very short distance and then resume its laminar trend, adhering to the lower profile of the bottom. So talking about interruptions in the floor, let's focus on two of Red Bull's own, one before the central section of the back and one in front of the elbow of the speaker. These interruptions do not have the function of increasing downforce as many would think, but they tend to cause an increase in pressure in that specific area, which subsequently reduces the speed of the airflow. However, their special function is to deactivate the porpoising phenomenon as the floor approaches the ground. So what effectively happens is that they prevent the triggering of jolts, which are generated by the reduction in ride height, and the aftermath of the entire process is increased downforce. Basically, if this is way too confusing for you to understand, Red Bull sacrifices a small part of the load potentially generated by the floor almost in contact with the ground, and the objective of traveling with minimum ride heights is definitely achieved without suffering the triggering of jolts. These variations are repeated at the rear of the car, precisely to manage the same phenomenon linked to the lowering of the rear axle when accelerating, which is consistently at full speed between the front and rear axles. This is something that you'd need years to extrapolate and implement on your own car, and this just goes to show how much of an advantage you have when a guy who was present during the ground floor era back in the 80s is now the chief engineer of your team. While we're yet to witness the floor of Aston Martin live, as their car was the only one that didn't have a trip to heaven in Monaco, it's safe to say that their design is very close to the Red Bull's floor, considering the fact that the entire motivation for the 2023 Challenger of Aston Martin is drawing inspiration from the RB18 and the RB19. However, their recent statement said that while many were eager to copy the design of Red Bull's floor, Aston Martin would be going down their own path and therefore be a bit more creative, hoping that their approach would serve as a good breeding ground for a competitive car in the remainder of the season. But from the flaws that we were able to see and analyse, if you were to compare all three of them, the Ferrari and Mercedes flaws seem to have the most similarities between each other, hence the proximity in competitiveness. On the other hand, the Venturi channels on the RB19, with the interruptions on their profile with clear jolts that determine areas of high pressure, seem like a technique that would take a bit more time to be learned and mastered by the other rivals. A process that we hope will happen this year, because it's definitely the benchmark that Red Bull has set in terms of being the master of the grid.